Good morning and welcome to Midlands Matters. My name's Tony Clyburn, and this morning we're going to talk about a couple of important events. First of all, starting off with March 24th through 28th, 2025. That is the virtual annual South Carolina Victims' Rights Week. And April 1st through 3rd is the in-person annual South Carolina Victims' Rights Week. April also happens to be Child Abuse Prevention Month. And now to Midlands Matters. Our guest this morning, we have Brian Bennett, former police officer, now retired from the South Carolina Criminal Justice Academy. We'll get some background on how he got here and became an advocate for victims. And on the telephone this morning, say hello to Molly Vick. Good morning, Molly.
Good morning.
I'm glad to have you in the house, as it were. Brian, tell us, you were a cop, taught at the Criminal Justice Academy, and now you're sitting before me.
Yeah, so quickly, I started my career here in the Columbia area after college, getting my criminal justice degree, and progressed through some local agencies, a short time with the federal agency, and for the last 16 years of my 26-year career, I was a full-time instructor at the State Police Academy where I specialized in domestic violence, elder abuse, and strangulation assaults, and that was within the behavioral science area of the Criminal Justice Academy.
I've watched a million TV shows, cop shows, and not once have I ever seen them talk about strangulation where the person wasn't dead. Brian's the first guy who ever told me you could be strangled and not die. But before you tell that story, I want to bring in Molly Vick, who is an independent consultant. You help families, you help victims. How did you get into that line of work, Molly?
Well, I was a victim of domestic violence back in 2021, and I didn't know anything about our court system at the time, and I ended up realizing that I was my own biggest advocate and that I could trust myself to learn and make sure that I could protect myself if I wasn't going to be informed otherwise. So I've done a lot of independent work, like you said, and I help people kind of navigate the system. You know, our courts are super overloaded, and I think it's helpful when you have someone who's been through it to kind of not give legal advice, but to share their experience in a way that's helpful to others.
Hey, I'm curious, Brian, since you have dealt with a lot of lawyers on the other side, and the cops, of course, training cops, what are they missing in the whole legal process?
Well, it's just the fact that the legal process is very detailed and very logistical. And so without knowing the right terminology and the right processes, it can be hard to navigate for the layperson. Communication is key. Being informed is key. And it also helps reduce the anxiety that comes with a lot of times dealing with a situation that you were never prepared for.
Yeah. Molly, were you prepared in any way? Had you had any self-defense classes? Did you know you were going to be around this person? Was this person a violent person? Anything that presented now in retrospect that would have told you that you might be in for a bad moment?
So I was actually in a dating relationship with this person, and I wouldn't have dated him if I knew he was violent, but it turned out he was a violent person and had a violent history and past. So I was not prepared for that situation, you know, physically, emotionally, mentally, even from an educational standpoint. So I definitely second all of Brian's sentiments as far as, you know, communication and the roles that each party plays. And it's hard when I can't speak personally, but I'm sure as a lawyer, it's got to be difficult when they have to be emotionally removed, right? Because like you said, it's procedure, it's logistics, and they have a job to do that goes beyond the scope of, how would I say this, the emotional support aspect of it, right? And so I found for myself, at least, it's very relieving for me to get knowledge about whatever it is I'm doing, but especially with this. So I did a lot of reading. I watched a lot of ETV. I had a prosecutor, a city prosecutor, tell me one time, well, you know, us being lawyers doesn't mean that we agree or disagree with the legislature, but, you know, maybe you should look into that. And I couldn't believe he told me that. And at the time, I was just so upset by that. And then I took his advice and started learning and reading. And I kind of really nerd out with that type of information at this point.
In other
So,
words, was that guy telling you that our laws don't necessarily work in the victim's favor?
I don't want to speak for him, but he was, I think the best way to describe it in context would be, I was pretty upset at the time of our conversation, because I was like, how is this a misdemeanor? How is this not considered violent? And how, it felt like the equivalent of a traffic ticket.
If you could, just tell us what happened and what the charge was. Just a little bit. I don't want to drag you through this whole thing.
Okay. And for a little bit of extra context, too. So there are municipal courts and there are general sessions courts, right? So your lower level offenses are going to be in municipal court. And interestingly to me, harassment falls under a pretty low offense. So this person had been, after violently assaulting me, and he was charged with domestic violence in the second degree, he stalked me, and my phone was ringing over like 60 times an hour. So every minute. Yeah. And I was, he was texting me, telling me he knew where I was, and he was not lying. He was stalking me while I was hiding from him. And I was granted an emergency order of protection following that assault. I moved all of my stuff out of the house, and I started staying with friends just a couple of days at a time. And then I would go to a different friend's house because I didn't want to be in one place for too long. And I was, my friends loved me enough to be okay with me shuffling between them. And so I don't know how he found me. He had been previously convicted of cyber stalking, which is terrifying. And that has to do with tracking someone's phone or devices. So the harassment charge basically got dismissed because he pled to the domestic violence. And then I got a notice in the mail from the city court after he had been sentenced. He got a 14-year suspended sentence to 5 years of probation. And so I called to check on that. And that's when I had that conversation with the prosecutor, who told me that I needed to figure out who my legislators were and contact them.
Oh, stop right there. We're going to breathe. Bennett's waiting to get in here. Brian, you've heard this story before, I bet, from Molly, but from other people. And what's the best thing to do, knowing the facts that you have right there?
Well, the harsh reality to some is that, we have to operate within the laws that we have.
Yeah, but what do I do once, my sister is being stalked? She's moving from house to house. She's putting other people in danger. And this is just what I know. You can't sleep. You can't work. You can't go any place this person might suspect you would be, or you're going to be in danger. Yeah.
Well, Molly did what was one of the best things we recommend, which is to try to hide your location and go from place to place. But that can be hard in the day of technology where things can be so easily tracked. It's very, very difficult these days. What we would tell most people is to connect with a local law enforcement agency or a victim, what we call a victim service group. Many times that may be one of the domestic violence shelters in the area. Now, let's talk about that for a minute. We got 46 counties in South Carolina, but on average, we only have 12 to 15 shelters that are operational. So one shelter may serve 3 or 4 different counties. And someone going to a shelter on a temporary basis, although it sounds as an option, isn't the most desirable option to people. They want to a lot of times be in their own place and places
the place
that are
you're paying for, the place where your animals are and your children should be.
Exactly. So, so one option that would be provided would perhaps be one of those shelters, but then what is there to fill the gap afterward or in place of? And that is where that network of friends and family really come into play. And fortunate for Molly is that she had friends that were willing to bring her in and essentially put themselves in harm's way, because as she disclosed, he was actively tracking her and stalking her, which means that all those people that assisted her could have been in harm's way too. Even though their intentions were to help her, they could have unknowingly endangered themselves. herein lies the problem with a lot of our situations is what options are there available, and the options that we do have don't fit every situation.
No,
And
these are very narrow options. I
Yep.
was surprised in doing just a little bit of research to find out that South Carolina is a top 10 highest in violent crime, murders, aggravated assaults, robberies, rapes. And Molly, you were kind of in that groove where any of these things could have been an addendum to what the initial crime was. By the way, before I make a pivot here, where is that person?
He's currently in prison in SCDC custody following, like I said, he was given a 14-year sentence suspended to 5 years of probation, which means the judge imposes the 14-year sentence and says, I'm going to give you probation for this amount of time, and if you violate that probation, this sentence will be enforced. So it's essentially a gracious opportunity to behave and follow the law and be a decent member of the community. So he was charged in an incident unrelated to me about a year ago, and a new judge upheld the order of the previous judge, who was very clear that if he were to be arrested again, he would have to serve that sentence. Not convicted, but arrested.
Are you afraid?
Of him getting out?
Yes.
Yeah, so he was sentenced to 10 years actually, because he had 3 different victims in 1 year, which is another issue with how things are handled in the court.
What did he say to you that made him seem like a nice guy?
He wasn't like, I didn't get love bombed. It wasn't like that. It was pretty normal. It was pretty, I didn't notice the red flags at the beginning until it was a little too late.
I'm just wanting to know because there's somebody else listening to you this morning who's like, that feels a little familiar. If someone's intuition is kicking in right now, they've had these suggestions in their own head that maybe the person they're with is not the person they should be with, or they may not survive the relationship. What's your advice to them?
This is an interesting question, and one that people actually ask me kind of often, and it's hard to answer. I think that I want to say this first is preventatively, don't rush into anything with anyone. I think it's helpful in a matters of protecting yourself to actually gradually get to know someone. I kind of jumped into this situation with this person very, very quickly, and that was my first mistake. And if you do find yourself in a situation where everything happens really fast and suddenly it's a lot deeper than you intended for it to be, a lot of predators are very, very good at isolating their victims from their friends and their family and their community. And that also happens pretty quickly. So I would encourage everybody to, if it is safe for you, to make sure that you are connected with a family member or a friend who is in contact with you, and try to start formulating a safety plan.
Molly, Vic, thank you very much. Thanks for the work you do in the community, too, to help other victims. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's Molly Vic. All right, Mr. Bennett, Brian Bennett, who consults and speaks on the subject of domestic abuse and violence. And as I mentioned at the top, South Carolina Victims' Rights Weeks are coming up. April is Child Abuse Prevention Month. We talked just for a second about strangulation.
Yes, sir.
Strangulation, you say, is an indicator that something really bad is going to happen if you survive the strangulation.
Yeah.
So tell me how you can be strangled and survive that.
Again, just to reiterate what you said, strangulation, or what we call non-fatal strangulation, by research has shown us pretty substantially that it is the number one indicator of a future homicide that will occur. What the data and research is telling us is that individuals who utilize strangulation to control another person have demonstrated the mindset of a killer, in that they can rationalize putting a person in a situation where their life could end. Now, interestingly, when you look at that non-fatal strangulation be the number one indicator of a homicide, usually those homicides occur by firearm. But what it was is that strangulation, or that act of non-fatal strangulation, was the warning shot, as we call it, that something much more serious is going to occur down the road. And when people hear there's going to be a homicide, the first person that they, I think, rightly think of is the person who was the target of the strangulation. But what we've also come to know is that those people that strangle other people, doesn't matter if it's in domestic violence or on a child or an elder or a sexual assault victim or a kidnapping victim or a human trafficking victim, those are commonly the people that shoot and kill our police officers. Those are also the people that would utilize firearms in a mass shooting incident. So again, data and research is telling us that these people are killers. If they have strangled somebody as a means of control, they are willing to kill.
How much strength does it take to strangle somebody?
Very, very little, and that's one of the misconceptions, is that someone has to be of strong size or strength to render someone completely helpless. And the reality is that it takes, depending on the structures of the neck that are affected, it can take as little as 5 pounds of pressure for about 5 to 10 seconds to render you unconscious.
You know, when we were kids, we used to do the wrestling thing all the time,
Right.
you know, the sleeper hold, which I guess is a form of strangulation.
It is. It
the way you
absolutely is a
describe
form of
it.
strangulation. Yeah.
My mom would say, don't do that.
Right.
She never told us why. It was just, don't do that. 5 pounds of pressure. I don't know what that is.
So
I'm going to reach across the counter. Mm-hmm. Just shake my hand and let me see what's 5 pounds of pressure.
Okay. So Tony and I are shaking hands right now. It's just
That's
average,
a routine. That's an average handshake.
That average handshake, when you measure it pounds per square inch, is about 60 pounds of pressure per square inch. It doesn't feel like that because the size of our hands disperses that pressure over a larger area. Another more common thing, aside from shaking the hand, and 60 to 80 pounds of pressure per square inch is the measurement of the average handshake. An example that I give also, too, is opening a can of soda. It takes about 20 pounds of pressure per square inch to pull the tab on a metal soda can. So when you think 5 pounds of pressure, that's 5 pounds of pressure per square inch, that's what it takes to close off your carotid artery and starve your brain of the needed oxygen.
You made the point to me when we were just chatting coming into the room that cops in South Carolina are not allowed to deprive anyone of air. You can't do a George Floyd on somebody in South Carolina and not hear about it from SLED or the local prosecutor.
No, right. And so because of situations like that have occurred nationally in different areas of the country, different states, and including South Carolina, passed different levels of a law enforcement reform bill back in 2023. And in that law enforcement reform bill, it specifically states that law enforcement officers cannot use chokeholds or neck restraints as it is considered deadly force. So
but
yeah,
if I'm just a guy out in the community that decides I want to strangle my girlfriend or neighbor, or vice versa,
mm-hmm.
you know, you're the girl who decides she wants to strangle her husband or boyfriend. Mm-hmm. It doesn't necessarily work that way.
Correct. I mean, we have some very limited language in our existing domestic violence law, but it's very confusing to navigate, and it's not specific enough to what we know about the signs and symptoms and the way that people are strangled. So what's interesting is our legislature has recognized that a neck hold or neck restraint is inherently dangerous, could cause death, and we've limited that action to law enforcement officers. Can't do that unless lethal force is necessary. But we haven't specified it with a specific statute in South Carolina that defines strangulation and then applies the necessary penalties to doing that. And I tell everybody, if somebody were strangling you, if somebody had their hands or a ligature around your neck, would you do everything up into lethal force, using lethal force to save your life? I've never had anyone say no. And when people come to that realization, that is what is kind of the barometer that shows everybody how serious this is. With small amounts of pressure for the right duration, which doesn't take long at all, you can suffer permanent brain injury and then ultimately die. But interestingly, a lot of cases people are strangled and never lose consciousness. And there's another stark reality. You don't have to lose consciousness to suffer permanent injuries that you will have the rest of your life or even die later. Strangulation victims can actually die hours, weeks, or months later from the internal complications from being strangled, even if they don't lose consciousness.
How did you get into this? I mean, you were a beat cop. You were working this beat right here on Main Street in Columbia.
Right.
And then what happened that sent you over to Criminal Justice Academy to teach cops?
Well, I'd always had it in my career path to teach. I just love to teach. And I had a lot of great officers share information with me, and so I progressed through my career and got more and more advanced levels of training. I've been to 35 or 40 different types of schools of about everything, forensic pathology and death scene investigation and crime scene. I mean, all kinds of stuff.
And one TV show has ever shown strangulation that I recall where the person died 2 months after they were actually strangled.
Yeah, you never see that on a TV show. Yeah, it was 2 months later. It was always, the person's, deceased.
They were strangled and there's the body.
Yeah, and there's the body.
Yeah.
But so obviously there are people out there that complete the act of strangulation, but there's thousands upon thousands of strangulations. There is no death. And there is no loss of consciousness, but people are suffering some very serious life-altering injuries. And so for me, what got me into this area was an exposure that I had through a group out of California called the Institute on Strangulation Prevention. And roughly 20 years ago, both a prosecutor and a defense attorney recognized a common thread in domestic homicides, and that was these patterns of strangulation before the death occurred. And so what they started doing is they started researching it through the means and methods that they had, and over 20 years of going across the country, research has continued to support that strangulation is that number one indicator. So they created a school.
Will the Uniform Crime Report say strangulation
No.
is the cause of death?
No. So you might
Can
have...
I charge somebody with strangulation in South Carolina?
There is no specific charge for strangulation.
So I charged them with what? Aggravated assault?
Exactly. It would go under like aggravated assault.
So you're saying South Carolina needs a strangulation statute so we can actually charge you with that?
Correct.
Whether the victim is dead or alive.
Right. And it also it's not just to charge them for that specific charge because of that specific act, but in South Carolina, we don't have a good way to track it. And so you mentioned the UCR codes and stuff like that. So to familiarize people with what that is, that stands for Uniform Crime Report, and it is a coding system that the FBI uses to categorize different types of crimes. Unfortunately, those UCR codes, there's a limited number of those codes, and essentially they become like an umbrella.
Just like the doctor's office.
Right.
If you're in between,
Yeah.
that'd help you.
So there might be a strangulation event that occurred, but you might be charged as a low-level domestic violence charge, a misdemeanor. It could be a felony-level aggravated assault. It could be, unlawful conduct toward a child because a child was involved. It could be abuse of a vulnerable adult, which is another statute.
Would a general practitioner, a doctor, recognize strangulation? Would a school nurse recognize strangulation?
No.
Most medical professionals, probably short of the coroner, who
Right.
has some time with the body,
Right. So
probably wouldn't recognize it.
So remember something. Your coroners in South Carolina are elected. They don't have to have a medical degree. So even your coroners, and this is no slight on them, it's just there's a difference between a medical examiner
Who's going to be a physician?
and a pathologist,
right,
versus
physician.
who the coroner is. And so you have the coroner, signs off on the death certificates and the death reports, but there's a medical examiner. So unless you have the right people looking at the situation, it's easy to miss. It would be startling for people to know that most if not all of your physicians and most if not all of your nurses and even your paramedics and EMTs don't get any formal training on strangulation, signs, symptoms, and injuries, or courses of treatment or exams that need to be ordered. People that have a more familiar education is what we call our forensic nurse examiners or what we call our sexual assault nurse examiners.
There can't be many in this state. We have 5 million people. How many of them are there?
There is a very select group of nurses in South Carolina who have very specialized training to not just medically triage those individuals, but they are also very critical to collecting the forensic evidence of strangulation. Unless you have people at a level of awareness and proficiency to recognize these subtle signs and symptoms, and many of them are very subtle, we have victims who are not getting the appropriate medical triage, and then we also have offenders who are not being held accountable for these actions that could kill a person.
So the one question a doc, a nurse, somebody should ask is what? And I don't mean it for it to be an overt question, but somebody comes to me, are they gasping for breath? Do they just look out of control? Maybe if they have white skin, you can see there are thumbprints someplace they shouldn't be. But if you have darker skin, not necessarily so. So what's the one question you can ask? It's a question in the clear, but it's kind of clandestine as to what you're looking for.
Honestly, there's a series of questions that need to be asked, but if I could narrow it down to one question as the start, what, if anything, are you feeling that is unusual for you? In other words, what is not normal for you right now? Because no one knows themselves better than themselves, and they know what their daily normal is. And that is a very open and non-leading question that doesn't suggest anything, but opens the window for someone to express, well, I'm having trouble swallowing. I have soreness in my neck. And disclose some of these more subtle signs and symptoms. Now, when you get into the training that I do, where I train all these different professionals, I will train them on the correct series of questions to be more specific, still non-leading, but getting to the more subtle signs and symptoms, because you mentioned like the marks on the neck. One of the reasons that I started to specialize in this, because in the early stages of my law enforcement career, what we were told was look for marks on the neck and petechial hemorrhages in the eyes, and that's essentially the capillaries of the eyes bursting.
Your eyes are bulging.
Yeah. And that would be an indicator that someone was strangled. That was bad science. That was not based on research. That was very anecdotal. In 50% of cases, both fatal cases and non-fatal cases, your victim will have no external injuries that you can see.
If, ladies and gentlemen, you have been strangled and you know what's happened in your house, you need to find your way to the emergency room pronto,
right,
to make sure you are not slowly fading away from us.
Correct. And a lot of these internal injuries may be dismissed by the person themselves, the victim themselves, or they won't even feel it at all. When we talk about damage to our carotid arteries and the veins that could occur, you're not going to feel that as the victim, but you will suffer the ill effects of the damage that has created. But by that time, it may be too late. So in my trainings, I always advise the number one priority for any person who's been strangled or any person who talks to another who's been strangled or indicates strangulation is get to the emergency room as soon as possible.
Listen, very quickly, South Carolina is going to have to make some changes to our state law. Brian Bennett has told us that. That means you're going to have to get on the phone with somebody who's representing you in the Senate and the State House in South Carolina and tell them that they need to read up on this and get back with you on it.
We have a bill in the State House right now. It's House Bill 3522, and there's about 7 House representative members who have co-sponsored that bill. So we have something in the legislature right now, but we've also had this bill filed 3 previous times, and it didn't go far enough to become a law. Let's
get this done. What's the easiest way to get a hold of you and get more information?
Yeah, so the best way, the platform that I'm using right now is Facebook. I have a Facebook group page called Strangulation Law for SC, just SC's abbreviated for South Carolina. It is a private group that you can request to join, and on there I have information about the bill, how it's being tracked, the wording of it. I also have training videos. I have documents you can download for friends or family. It's a complete dive into the awareness of everything around non-fatal strangulation, not just in South Carolina, but anybody from another state would find resources on there that they could use to get educated or share information.
Thanks for being totally absorbed so you could share that with us this morning. We've only gotten just a few words in on this, but folks, if you're in a dangerous situation, call 911. If you're in a dangerous situation right now, if you have the chance to deep dive, please. Facebook Strangulation
Law for SC for
Simple
South Carolina
on Facebook. And thank you for your time.
Yes,
Brian
sir.
Bennett.
Thank you.
And thank you to Molly Vick, survivor, who shared her story with us earlier. That's Midlands Matters for this morning, a presentation of Midlands Media Group, all rights reserved. Have a good weekend. Hope you learned something. I'm Tony Clyburn. Till next week, so long.